Well, I think there are four main figures who are driving policy, the Trump administration's policy against Venezuela. First and foremost, I guess there is Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who has his origins in the Tea Party movement, which is, this very far right representation of the Republican Party in the United States, and has taken up basically a very warmongering tone towards Venezuela, but not only towards Venezuela, towards all countries that the United States opposes, most notably, of course, Iran, but of course, Syria as well, and then, of course, in terms of economic policy, also against China. And so that's he's one of the key people. Rex Tillerson, his predecessor, was much more moderate in that sense, which is one of the reasons he ended up being kicked out of the Trump administration. The other person who's probably even more hawkish than Mike Pompeo, which is perhaps hard to believe, is National Security Advisor John Bolton, who also has a long history in the United States of supporting all of its foreign military adventures, including, of course, most notably the war against Iraq. He's also one of the people who was a member of the Project for a New American Century, which outlined a plan back in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, for regime change in just about the entire Middle East, starting with, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq, and including Iran, Syria, all of these countries. And they're basically, and he's determined to fulfill that plan, essentially. And now he's added Venezuela basically to that list, of course, Cuba and Nicaragua being the other countries in the Western Hemisphere that he would like to see regime change in. He was considered for a long time to be too radical. As a matter of fact, in the George Bush administration, he was eventually pushed aside, mainly because of his views were considered to be too extreme when he was ambassador to the United Nations. And a third figure who's kind of resurrected from the dead, it seems sometimes, is Elliot Abrams, whom Trump named the special envoy for Venezuela. He has a long history, especially in Latin America and especially in Central America, for supporting right-wing governments and even supporting death squad governments, particularly in El Salvador and in Guatemala, and has this long history of U.S. intervention and trying to also promote regime change. Yeah, as a matter of fact, he was also deeply involved in the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s, in which the Reagan administration had traded weapons with Iran in order to fund the Sandinistas, to fund the Contras against the Sandinistas, and was actually convicted, but later pardoned. And now that's all, of course, old history, and everybody's forgotten about this. That somebody who actually has a criminal record is now leading U.S. policy against Venezuela. And the fourth person, who's often not very considered a part of this team, but actually I think ought to be considered to be a part, is Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from the state of Florida, who has also taken up this cause, particularly since there's a lot of right-wing Venezuelans and, of course, right-wing Cubans in his home state, whom he's catering to, and has taken an extremely hawkish attitude towards Venezuela, but not only Venezuela, of course, towards Cuba and also towards Iran. So he belongs really, politically, ideologically, in that same category as Pompeo, Bolton, and Elliot Abrams. Yeah, I mean, they're trying to present a united front against the Maduro government, but actually there's constant infighting within the opposition in Venezuela. And it's very fractious. It's one of the reasons why they've been so unsuccessful, even in light of the severe economic problems that Venezuela has had. I mean, you'd normally think that if a country goes through a severe economic crisis the way Venezuela has, that this would be an excellent opportunity for an opposition, any opposition, to to beat the existing government on a number of different fronts, but they failed time and time again, largely because they can never agree on a united strategy on how to go about it. And it's kind of difficult to really understand why they're exactly divided so much. I think part of the reason is that they lack a strong leader, in a sense, that they rally behind, the way Chavez united the progressive forces in Venezuela or the left forces in Venezuela. They don't have any figure like that. And the other thing is, I think they're also filled with a lot of individuals who all hope to be president of Venezuela at some point. So there's an incredible amount of internal rivalries. Every time there's a disagreement, one of them, ends up forming a new political party. For example, Primero Justicia has, splintered a number of different times, which is, the party that Leopoldo Lopez used to belong to, and Enrique Capriles, a former presidential candidate, currently belongs to. Leopoldo Lopez split off and created the Popular Will Party, to which Juan Guaido is a member. It's now considered to be, one of the most right-wing political parties. That is the most radical in a way, because they have the most maximalist demands, which is the immediate resignation of Maduro and the immediate instatement of Guaido as president. Not all of the parties actually and leaders in the opposition share that point of view. Actually, a number of other opposition leaders have expressed their support for negotiations, have even suggested that that Maduro could remain in president until there's negotiations have concluded and that there are new elections. But the Guaido faction is very clear about saying that any precondition for elections would be Maduro's resignation and Guaido's instatement, which is, of course, unacceptable to the Maduro government, which sees itself as being the legitimate government. So I think another, of course, reason for the internal divisions have to do with the economic backing that the different factions have. Some of them are backed by more transnational capital in a way, and others are backed more by the national capital. The national ones, I think, have a tendency to be a little bit more moderate because they see that their own economic fortunes are actually tied to the economic downturn, whereas the ones who are more backed by the international kind of capital, they see themselves as being able to withdraw from the country and therefore are not as impacted or can isolate themselves from the economic catastrophe or crisis that Venezuela is going through, and therefore are in a better position to set more maximalist demands. So those are cross-cutting. I mean, these different interests, they cut in many different ways. So that's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it does help to make a little bit more sense of the situation. I think one of the things that that the Venezuelan opposition, forgets is its history of failures, and so and not only that, the United States with a new president, that is President Trump, also hasn't been aware of the history of the opposition's failures, and so when Juan Guaido presented the Trump administration with this plan to overthrow the Maduro government, they managed to convince the Trump administration relatively easily that this could be done. They figured, crisis, and with lack of popular support for Maduro, we just need to declare, a parallel government, and everybody will switch sides, and it's a done deal. And so they sold that plan, I think, to a relatively ignorant U.S. government, and their own hubris, which has been repeated time and time again, played also a very large role in this. I think many of the more experienced politicians in Venezuela did not believe that would happen, and were therefore reluctant actually to support Guaido. But Guaido, being a young person without much knowledge of Venezuelan history, because he's only 35 years old. I mean, he was 15 when Chavez was first elected. So he didn't have that history really in mind of how the things that the opposition had tried to do in order to overthrow Chavez already. So I think that's an important factor, this lack of history and lack of biographical evidence. Now, eventually, of course, all of their plans failed. They had several attempts, first on January 23rd, then on February 23rd, when they did this kind of, humanitarian aid delivery project, and they were hoping again that the military would switch sides. And then again, I think it was, now I might get the date wrong, I think it was April 10 or so. They tried again on the April 30th. Was the last major push with the military at the military air base, or at least it was outside of the military air base, La Carlota in Caracas, where they all again thought that they had, it was just a matter of, everybody switching sides and it would happen, and, it would be a bloodless coup, perhaps, is what they had, this fantasy. Of course, that did not happen. So I think these repeated failed attempts definitely marked a huge shift within the opposition's thinking, what needs to be done, and finally brought them around to recognize that the only way out is really a negotiated solution. That a quick, coup is not going to happen. And I think even the Trump administration is recognizing it. Now, as I said before, I still think there's an important internal division in the opposition where the Guaido faction basically still is insisting that Maduro has to resign before there can be any real, progress, so to speak. So in a way, they're still trying to stick to their very maximalist demand, whereas other opposition factions are supporting a more reasonable line, I would say, in the sense that they're talking about, well, the main thing is to have a new electoral council and to look at, what kind of process can we develop towards our goal, which is to have new elections, and rather than trying a maximalist line that seems really uncompromising. And that's what the Guaido plan is. It's totally uncompromising still, actually. Well, I think the opposition in Venezuela is playing, and so is the United States government, they're playing a very dangerous game, where on the one hand, they're trying to create an atmosphere in which they're saying we're willing to do the maximum, which is a military intervention, in order to pressure and to scare, I think, the Maduro government. Now, the Maduro government is not being scared very easily, and neither is the military in Venezuela, because they know that a military intervention is not going to be an easy thing for the United States. And I mean, it was really crazy. Just last weekend, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's very close to the Trump administration and a very influential senator, was on television talking openly about the importance of a military intervention, and said it very blatantly. And he said that we ought to have the same operation as Reagan did in 1983 when the government of Grenada was overthrown, which is a tiny island nation of something like 100,000 inhabitants, which had maybe at the most a couple thousand, soldiers. Venezuela is a completely different situation with 30 million inhabitants and several 100,000 soldiers. So it just doesn't make any. I mean, the comparison is just ridiculous. But they're trying to create this atmosphere or this threat to scare Maduro. But like I said, that seems pretty naive on their part to think that Maduro or the military are going to be scared by this, because even within the Trump administration, a number of voices have come out, also within the Pentagon, saying that a military intervention really is not on the table for Venezuela, and because they know that this is not going to be an easy thing. I mean, Venezuela hasn't been disarmed the way Iraq was before the intervention in Iraq. Iraq had been completely disarmed before it was invaded, basically, in 2003. And the situation is, it's just completely different. There's just no comparison. and there's no international coalition either. Even though something like 50 countries have recognized Guaido, none of the other countries except the United States supports a military intervention. So not even especially not actually Venezuela's neighbors, Colombia and Brazil, even though those are the two most right-wing governments. They know that that would be a catastrophe for them, not necessarily militarily, but in terms of the number of refugees that would be streaming over their borders, and that would lead to a disastrous situation for their countries. So they're totally opposed to it. So anyway, I don't think it's going to happen. However, this constant saber rattling is creating an atmosphere where tensions could actually accidentally result in some kind of a military incident that could lead to an actual war. So that's why, even though I think these threats are hollow, they could potentially have very dangerous consequences. Well, the current economic situation, I would say, or the worst economic problems in Venezuela at the moment definitely are directly traceable to the economic sanctions. But that's not to say that the Maduro government didn't commit mistakes. As a matter of fact, it opened itself, created a wide opening for the United States to impose sanctions that would have a devastating effect. And specifically, what I'm thinking of is the Maduro government's exchange rate policy, which did not help. Actually, I think it contributed to the economic decline that began when the oil prices started declining in 2014. And actually, already there's indications that the economic crisis already started before that. That is, the economy started contracting already before 2014, actually right after Maduro became president in 2013. And again, I think this is mostly traceable to the exchange rate policy, which made imports actually, ironically, very cheap because of the high black market exchange rate, and basically killed off all of domestic production because the imports ended up being cheaper than what you could produce domestically, which killed the domestic economy. Venezuela is still a mostly private-run economy, and therefore they didn't have a chance. And it also created enormous shortages at the same time. And so that created this economic contraction. But things got much worse when the sanctions were introduced in mid-2017, which in a first phase affected mostly Venezuela's bond market, but it had ripple effects throughout the economy. First of all, because Venezuela wasn't able to restructure its debt, it had to pay off enormous debt burdens in principal and interest, and so it meant less money was available for imports, therefore more shortages. Then it also froze, those sanctions froze Venezuela's bank accounts, international bank accounts, which made it also more difficult to import things. And the U.S. government also behind the scenes, and this wasn't even officially announced, in late 2017 was telling companies and banks to close Venezuelan bank accounts and to stop transactions, informally saying that you could be affected by secondary sanctions, secondary basically penalties because of the existing sanctions that basically have ripple effects throughout the financial system. So that's when the real economic crisis really started hitting, and it became even worse, of course, in the early of this year of 2019, when all imports of Venezuelan oil into the United States were basically halted, which is Venezuela's main market for selling its oil. And it had to scramble to look for new export markets, and that has been a very difficult process. And it had to sell much of its oil at very steep discounts, making it much more difficult to earn the money that it needs. Yeah, actually, we just published a report at the Real News which talks about specifically one of the effects is that, for example, the water shortage. Now, normally you'd think, well, water comes, from Venezuela. So how can then the sanctions affect the water shortage in Venezuela? Well, actually, Venezuela's barrios, they're all located high on the hills, and they need to pump the water up to the hilltops where the poor neighborhoods tend to be in Caracas, for example. And those pumping stations are breaking down because of lack of repair parts. Those parts come mostly from the United States, but even if they come from other countries, it's been very, very difficult for Venezuela to import now these replacement parts in order to get these pumps functioning again. And so they've been able to pump the water to the barrios, and so there's severe water shortages as a result. They have to drive trucks up there, and people have to carry the water, and so that's one example. And of course, the other examples have to do also with the power outages. Venezuela relies, something like 80% of its power comes from the dam, from hydroelectric source, which was, well, the government says it was sabotaged, others say it was neglect, but the point is that it has been very difficult to reestablish a stable supply of power because, again, the generation and the transmission systems all depend on importing replacement parts that are very difficult for Venezuela to come by now. So this has increased the number of power outages. And also backup generators and backup power plants have not been able to come online because Venezuela cannot import the fuel needed for these, because it doesn't produce enough of that fuel itself, which is mostly diesel. And so these power shortages, basically, or outages, continue. So those are some of them, some examples. The other example, of course, is shortages of food and medicine. I think the worst, the most dramatic problem is really in the medicine shortage area, because Venezuela does not have a large pharmaceutical industry of its own. It has a very small one. It can produce some medicines, but not the most sophisticated ones, for example, for treating HIV or cancer and things like that. And those are deadly diseases. Or insulin is another major one that Venezuela cannot produce itself. It has to rely on imports. So these are actual sanctions that end up killing people because they don't have access to the needed medicines in time in order to save their lives. So that's very, very serious. So the food shortages problem is not as serious, I think, as people might think. That is, all food is available. Venezuela does produce a tremendous amount of its own food. So that's not quite as big, I think, a problem as in the areas of medicine, water, and electricity.